Let me just go over a little bit of the agenda. So what we wanted to do is do an overview of all the major changes and talk about the new definition of a clinical trial, talk about how that has affected all of the reissued funding opportunity announcements for the NIH, and then once you get into your application process, talk about specifically the new form that is called the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form and some of the components within that, and then also talk about how these changes relate to future integration with clinicaltrials.gov, because that will affect sort of how you deal with some of these application components from here on out. So NIH has greatly expanded what the definition of a clinical trial is for NIH applications, or just clinical trials in general. So there are essentially 4 questions that they force you to answer every time you apply now. So question number 1, does the study involve human subjects? Question 2, are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? And just to note that the definitions for what prospectively assigning an intervention mean are available on the NIH website for you to review if you're not entirely sure what those terms mean. The third question is your study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants themselves? And then lastly, is the effect that will be evaluated a health-related biomedical, or behavioral outcome? So if you answered yes to all 4 of these questions, your study now meets the definition of a clinical trial, even if it doesn't involve drugs or devices. So what you'll notice is that a lot of your behavioral mechanistic studies now meet the definition of a clinical trial. And to kind of help you figure out whether your specific study meets this definition or not, there is a link that they provide that we have here where they've listed a couple dozen case studies. So there are different scenarios of studies, and they define whether those studies meet the definition of a clinical trial or not. So you can review those and see which ones are closest to your proposed study to see if your study really meets that definition or not. If you're still not sure after reviewing these and you're kind of on the fence, the NIH recommends that you talk to the program officer for the funding opportunity announcement that you're planning to apply to for additional guidance. So with that new definition, what this means is that now we have a broader definition of what constitutes a clinical trial. And, especially at UCLA, but in general, we know there's a lot of investigators who've not previously had their studies classified as clinical trials, and now you're going to have to familiarize yourself with those clinicaltrials.gov requirements, and you're going to have to deal with those requirements at the application phase rather than waiting for funding and then dealing with it. So the point of these changes, as you'll see, is that they're meant to sort of coincide with the same requirements that are requested of you when you register clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, and they've basically added it to the NIH application form. So when you're submitting your R01 or whatnot, that information is essentially the same. So it's basically just doing things earlier in the process, and then more studies are now going to fall into this clinical trial definition. So what this also means is that the NIH has essentially either reissued or revised most of their funding opportunity announcements. So as you might have seen in the past few months, they've been releasing a lot more funding opportunity announcements. And what they've essentially done is, within the title, for the most part, of funding opportunities, they have classified the funding opportunity announcement whether they allow clinical trials or not. So the example I have on the screen is essentially the standard parent grant that used to be one funding opportunity. Now they've split it into 2. The first one, clinical trials are required, and then the second one, clinical trials are not allowed. So depending on how you've defined your study, using those 4 questions we just saw, you would have to apply to one of these funding opportunities depending on whether it's a clinical trial or not. And the other thing to point out is that for a lot of these parent grants, those clinical trial funding opportunities, not all of the NIH agencies, you can't apply to all of them under the clinical trial. So you have to review to make sure, first, that your study does or does not meet the definition of a clinical trial. If it does, look at that funding opportunity announcement and see if the particular agency you want to apply to is listed as one of the agencies for that opportunity. And there is a third funding opportunity listing that's called clinical trial optional, and that is sometimes used, and that just means your proposed study can either be a clinical trial or not. But for a lot of these parent grants and the reissued funding opportunities, you'll notice that it either says clinical trial required or not allowed, which in turn means that before you even identify your funding opportunity announcement that you want to apply to, you have to determine whether your study is going to meet the definition of a clinical trial. So in the new application form for NIH grants, regardless of whether your study meets the definition of a clinical trial, you're now required to include what's called a PHS, Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form. And we're going to do a brief rundown of what's included in that, because this is sort of comprehensive of all the changes that they've implemented. So we're going to talk about changes to the existing NIH grant component. So if you're familiar with submitting R01s, these will be familiar to you. And so we'll do a brief overview of what those changes are. We're going to talk about some of the new components they've added, and then again talk about the integration with clinicaltrials.gov. So on the screen is a list of the revised components that are would be familiar to you if you've submitted grants before, but basically things that you've seen. So protection of human subjects, inclusion of women, minorities, and children, with the caveat that this used to be two separate documents. So it was women and minorities, and a separate document, inclusion of children. It's now combined into one document, but it's essentially the same requirements. Eligibility criteria, statistical design and power, and then if it applies to your study, FDA-regulated interventions. So technically, none of these are new, but some of the specifics within them might have changed, and we'll talk about some of those later. So for the new components, whether you have a clinical trial or not will sort of determine which of these components you'll have to fill out, but if you have human subjects that are involved in your study, there's a number of new components you have to contend with. So within your application, you have to give individual study titles to each of your studies. And the reminder about that is within your application, you may have more than one study. So even within an R01, you know, we're seeing some people have up to 8 individual studies. You may have a clinical trial at the first start of the study, and then later on you have you're proposing maybe a small pilot award that might be considered a delayed onset study. And so those in themselves would be 2 separate studies, in which case you would need individual unique titles for each of them. And that is separate from your application title, so they're not the same thing. There's a new field called conditions or focus of the study, where you have to use mesh terms to list basically what condition or focus that your study is on, and that's by the study. So if you have multiple studies and they're each studying a different condition, you might have multiple conditions that you're studying. Recruitment and retention plan is a new document that needs to be uploaded. There was previously a section within the protection of human subjects document that was called the informed consent and recruitment plan. They've sort of extracted that out and then added a requirement for you to address a retention plan. So not only how you're going to recruit patients, but how you're going to keep them, especially if you have multiple visits planned. So if they have to come more than once, and especially if they are a particularly difficult group to recruit or retain, you do have to address that separately. Study timeline is a new component in that previously some funding opportunities would have required this, but now they're required for all studies that involve human subjects. And it's a separate upload. It's not part of your research strategy, so it doesn't count towards your page limitations, just like all these other components. But they do want you to address it. And we'll talk about that later, because the study timeline is new review criteria as well. So we need to pay some particular attention to that. If your study involves a multi-site domestic study, so you have multiple subawards within the U.S., you are required to include a single IRB plan. And the overall structure of the study team is a document where you just outline where the administrative and performance sites are located, so what that structure looks like. It is optional for human subjects, required for clinical trial studies. Brief study and narrative studies description are directly taken from clinicaltrials.gov, but they're basically just very brief overviews of what your proposed study protocol is going to be. And then the intervention section is a text field in which you list primary, secondary, other interventions that you plan, outcome measures as well, and then the dissemination plan, which we'll talk about at the end as well. So just a caveat that this is not the dissemination plan that would typically be included in your resource sharing plan. So it's not about disseminating data, like presenting at conferences and things like that. It's basically ensuring that if you have a clinical trial, that you are going to be compliant with the requirements for the clinicaltrials.gov registrations. So I did some screenshots here just to give you an overview of what this new form looks like to help run down what it's going to look like when you fill this out. So for each study you have within your application, as I mentioned earlier, you're required to have a study title. And regardless of whether your study meets the definition of a clinical trial, you're still required to fill out the clinical trial questionnaire just to make sure that you understand whether your study is a clinical trial or not. If you answer yes to all these questions and your study does meet that definition, but you are applying to a funding opportunity that does not allow it, this is not going to work. So it's sort of just a last check to make sure that whether your study is defined as a clinical trial or not. And this is for the study level. So if your application includes, say, one clinical trial and one study where there's no intervention, so it's just a human subject study, you would fill this out differently for each of those studies. Section 2 is required for all studies that involve human subjects, regardless of whether they're a clinical trial or not. So again, this is what you would fill out: the conditions or focus of the study. This is where you would put the eligibility criteria, the age limits, inclusion of women, minorities, and children, recruitment retention plan, etc. So as you'll notice from a lot of these requirements, this is a lot of the information that you would have previously included in the Protection of Human Subjects document. And so it's not necessarily a new requirement, it's just being put in a different place and in a different format. So what you'll notice for conditions or focus of the study and eligibility criteria, you're not actually uploading a document. You're basically copying and pasting text into a text field. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that means for revising the Protection of Human Subjects plan, but just to be aware that there are text field restrictions for a lot of these text field components. So for instance, eligibility criteria, you're supposed to list the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Typically you would do that with bullet points. If you're using bullet points in Word, you're going to lose a lot of that formatting, and so what they recommend is that you use just a dash or an asterisk to create a bullet point. All of your formatting, such as bolding, italic, any kind of proprietary fonts, things like that, are not going to carry over into these text fields. So just to be aware that because it's not an upload, you do have to be aware of the text field restrictions. And within each of these text field areas, there is usually a character limitation as well. We'll show you where you can get information on that at the end of the presentation. So if your study meets the definition of a clinical trial, you are also required to fill out Section 3, which is the protection and monitoring plans. If your study is not a clinical trial but does involve human subjects, most of these components are, well, I'll go through it individually. So protection of human subjects is required, as always. If your study is a multi-site study for human subjects, then you are required to have a single IRB plan. Data and safety monitoring plan, again, it's required for clinical trials and is optional for human subjects. So as the way it was previously, if you have particularly vulnerable patients or there's a risk of serious adverse events, even though you're not technically required, it may be better to include a plan even if it's not a clinical trial. So that remains optional for you. And then within your plan, if you are proposing a data and safety monitoring board, you just have to select yes or no to within the system. But the board itself should be described in the plan, so it's not a separate document. And then overall structure of the study team is only required for clinical trials, but again, optional for human subject studies. So if your study does meet the definition of a clinical trial, then you're required to fill out section 4, which is called the protocol synopsis. So if you are applying to a funding opportunity that does not allow clinical trials, you're not going to be allowed to fill this out. If you select no to any of those 4 clinical trial questions, you're not going to be allowed to fill this out. So it's basically just going to be only for clinical trials. And this is where the majority of these new components have come in. And so this is just a screenshot of what the components look like, but we're going to go into these in more depth in the next slide. So protocol synopsis includes summaries of the study, the interventions. You have to select in a drop-down what study phase your study is, and then what intervention model you're using, whether it's going to be blinded or not, outcome measures, statistical power and design, which again was a new upload here. And then if FDA regulated interventions apply to your study, then you have a special place to upload that information, and then the new dissemination plan at the end. So there is a section 5 that I didn't list on here, but it's only used for clinical trial funding opportunities that specifically request additional documentation. So there will be a separate component enabled if that applies. This is not used very often at the moment, so I didn't include it on here, but it would be specific to your funding opportunity. So one of the sort of newer components that's a required upload now is the study timeline. And when you look at the SF 424 guidelines that NIH provides when you're submitting your application, the instructions basically just say, provide a description or diagram describing the study timeline, and then it clarifies the study timeline should be general, meaning you can use phrases like 1 year after notice of award and should not include specific dates. So this at the outset seems pretty simple and pretty vague, kind of gives you a lot of room to put in items within your timeline that might make sense for your study. However, I did want to point out that the study timeline is also a new review criteria. So I wanted to go through what the review criteria looks like. So in addition to what your instructions are, this is what reviewers are going to be taking into account. They want to make sure that you've addressed startup activities, anticipated rate of enrollment, planned follow-up assessment. They want to make sure that your timeline is feasible and well justified. You know, if you're using any kind of institutional resources that increase the efficiency of components of the study, like patient enrollment, that you've incorporated that. And then you should also be addressing any potential challenges that you might anticipate, such as enrollment shortfalls. So I think this is just a really good example of the ways in which the new requirements might be a little confusing, because in one place you have what the specific instructions are, and then in another place you have what the reviewers will actually be looking for. And it's a little bit easier to kind of combine them together to look at this as a whole. So this study timeline can look like whatever you want. It could be a description or it could be a diagram, but it should address all of these bullet points collectively. So another thing that's pretty majorly revised is the protection of human subjects documents. And I think a lot of us are familiar with what this looked like before. And it's essentially the same, but there are a couple of items that were removed and put into different areas of the collection form. So things like the justification for the proposed use of human subjects is not there anymore. The description of the age range is not there anymore because it's its own field. Recruitment and informed consent has been removed and put into its own document. For FDA, IND, and IDE test articles, that's not required anymore because, again, there's a separate space for that to be uploaded. So for those of you that are familiar with the protection of human subjects document, this is just sort of a warning that these items should no longer be included in this document. They essentially have to be extracted and put into the components where they belong now. So on our website, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation, we have guidelines that walk you through what the protection of human subjects document needs to include, and then have highlighted all the areas that have been removed. And then as well, also highlighted the new areas that have been added. So They do require a very brief study design overview. They have clarified that you need to provide details on previously collected biospecimens, um, emphasis on if you have a study with caveats for adults that are unable to consent, you have to address potentially incidental findings if it's applicable to your project. And then there's a new section to specifically address vulnerable populations if that is part of your recruitment, your patient recruitment. And then a clarification that compensation is not considered a benefit of participating in the study. So that's not necessarily new, but they've clarified, they've highlighted that a little bit more. So just a reminder to take that out of your document if you had had that in there previously. So another new requirement that we've talked about earlier is the single IRB plan. And this is a new requirement for all NIH applications that involve multiple domestic performance sites. So basically they're looking for you to describe how you'll comply with the NIH policy on the use of single IRB for the multi-site research. You need to provide the name of the IRB that'll serve as the single IRB of record, otherwise known as the reviewing IRB institution, which in most cases will probably be UCLA if the PI is submitting from UCLA, but not always. And you have to indicate that all the identified participating sites have agreed to rely on your proposed single IRB, and that any sites that you may add after award will be required to do the same as well. So within that plan, you have to also describe how the communication is going to work across the sites prior to initiating the study, signing any authorization or alliance agreements that might be needed, and then indicating whether the institution or entity, i.e. UCLA, will maintain records of authorization or alliance agreements of the communication plan. But then just a reminder, don't actually include the authorization or alliance agreements or communication plan. So the IRB Reliance at research.ucla.edu is the email address for UCLA IRB Reliance office, and they've been really helpful in helping sort of customize and craft single IRB plans for individual studies. So if you have sites that you know will have problems with signing on to UCLA as the IRB of record, you probably want to reach out to the IRB office earlier rather than later to make sure. UCLA has signed on to what's called Smart IRB, and this is currently UCLA's preferred way of interacting with single IRBs. Many other research institutions, I think it's over 300 now, are also on single IRB to help make this process a little easier. But as it stands right now, you cannot submit an NIH application unless all of your participating sites have agreed to your single IRB plan. So this is something that may take a little bit longer to negotiate with your sites if you need particular IRB issues to be ironed out. However, with that being said, you do not need IRB approval prior to application. So you can still include IRB approval within your startup activities on your timeline. You just need to have a single IRB plan to submit to NIH during the application phase. So for clinical trials, one of the new requirements that you have to submit is what's called a brief summary. And the instructions for this on the NIH guidelines are that it's basically a text field, so you're not uploading anything, you're basically just typing text into a field. It's limited to 5,000 characters, which is not a whole lot. And it basically just says, enter a brief description of objectives of the protocol, including the primary and secondary endpoints, and then include a brief summary of the study hypothesis. And then what I wanted to point out was that clinicaltrials.gov also provides additional guidance on this. So the text that I have in blue under the brief summary is what we've extracted from the clinicaltrials.gov requirements. So within the NIH guidelines, nowhere in there does it say that you need to that a brief summary is a summarization for the lay public. But if you look at the what's called the studies description, but it's basically the brief summary on clinicaltrials.gov, their definition clarifies that this should be written in language intended for the lay public. And the reason for this is that if your clinical trial is funded, this is one of the components that will be publicly available on clinicaltrials.gov. So a lot of the reason that NIH has implemented a lot of these new changes is because they're attempting to collect all this study information at the application phase to sort of reduce the burden of complying with clinicaltrials.gov registrations um, at the clinical trial phase, to make sure that you remain compliant throughout the duration of the study by requiring this information earlier. This hasn't been completed yet, but the idea is that the format is essentially the same from the application to clinicaltrials.gov registration, so that they can build a system that'll work seamlessly together. So whatever you submit for your 5,000 character limit in NIH goes automatically to clinicaltrials.gov. So what you'll see is there's a lot of balance between these two. The names might be slightly different. So NIH applications might call it a brief summary, clinicaltrials.gov calls it study description, and then clarifies that it's for the lay public, but it's essentially a one-to-one relationship. And so the idea is that you're doing this to essentially prepare for eventual clinicaltrials.gov registrations. So with the brief summary, the related component, what they call the narrative study description, this is much larger. It's also a text field, but it is limited to 32,000 characters, which is a lot to put into a text field. And just a reminder that, for text fields, none of the formatting follows over, so it has to be 32,000 characters of unformatted text, essentially. So NIH states that you need to enter a narrative description of the protocol, including the more technical information that would not fit on the brief description above, but you are not to include the entire protocol. So if you already have a protocol that exists for the study that you're proposing, don't paste it all in there. This is more of a high level, almost like a protocol summary at this point. And then they also put a caveat that they do not want you to duplicate information that can be found elsewhere. So eligibility criteria, inclusion or exclusion criteria should not be in here because it's in its own text field somewhere else. The outcomes do not have to be described because they are listed somewhere else in this application. So they're basically telling you don't duplicate information. But you should describe your plans for the assignment of participants, describe the plans for delivery of the interventions, show that your methods for the sample size and data analysis are appropriate given those plans. And then if you plan to have a randomized control trial, then special methods are required. And then, of course, there's additional guidance if your study meets that definition. So again, this is another example of where the NIH is requiring information to have integration with clinicaltrials.gov. And so in clinicaltrials.gov, there's also a detailed, well, they call it a detailed description, but it's basically the narrative study description. And so they have additional rules here. So they say, this is an extended description of the protocol where you can include more technical information. Do not include the entire protocol, not duplicate information recorded elsewhere, etc. So you can see it's basically saying the same thing, even though the name is slightly different, and then the character limitation is the same, again, so that it can have that sort of seamless integration with clinicaltrials.gov. So statistical design and power is, it's a new document that needs to be uploaded, but again, if you're familiar with submitting grants to NIH, you're used to doing a design and power section of the grant. So we put together some recommendations based on some of the questions and feedback we've been getting from everybody, but essentially, when you read the NIH guidelines, they tell you that the information that you put in your research strategy should not be duplicative with the information that you're putting in other components of the grant. So that includes what you put in your statistical design and power document should not be duplicated in your research strategy. So the forms aren't meant to be duplicative, but it kind of seems like one of the questions we've been getting is, well, what do I put in my research strategy if I can't talk about the stat design and power? So in these areas where there's the potential for overlap, what we've heard recommended is basically just use your research strategy for higher level analysis and then leave the details in statistical design and power or other components. And one of the reasons for this is because your research strategy will always have page limitations. You know, it might be only 6 pages, might be only 12 pages, but statistical design and power, as of right now at least, as an upload, has no page limitations. And so you can really get into a lot of depth and detail about your design and power. And if you're, if you're unsure of if reviewers are actually going to be reading both of these documents, NIH encourages you to, within your research strategy, cite other components of your grant application. So within, maybe you have like an overview of what your methods and analysis are, and then you can say, see statistical design and power for more information. So then you're telling reviewers where they can find this information elsewhere in your application. And one of the other questions we've been getting is, well, if I take out my design and power, I basically have nothing in my grant, or I have a lot of leftover space. So one of the ways you can kind of fill up that space is focus more on the rigor and transparency requirements. Some guidance was released, I believe, back in 2016 for how to kind of address these issues. And now that you have like a little bit more space opened up, you can spend that addressing these new requirements and then referring people out to other components of the grant application that are no longer part of the research strategy. So with all of these new changes and updates, some of the biggest challenges that we've noticed is that logistically there's so many uploads and text fields that you have to contend with, and it requires a lot of extra coordination between PIs and admins and your fund managers. We're sort of past the days of just handing off your protection of human subjects document and just having your fund manager upload it. You really have to coordinate it with specifying exactly the age range of your participants so that they know which drop down to choose, separating out the recruitment and retention plan from the protection of human subjects documents. It's just a lot of extra work at the outset because just the sheer number of documents that have to be uploaded and text fields that have to be input and input without formatting have to be sort of addressed. So related to the text fields as well, just having an awareness of what those text field requirements are versus the document upload requirements. So the website I'll show you at the end, we have some guidance for each of the individual components, and we specify whether it's a text field or a document upload because the requirements are different. So with a document upload, it's kind of the same as usual. It's 0.5 margins and things, and formatting and things is okay. When you get to the text fields, you lose basically all that formatting, so then you have to think about different ways within the text field that you can work with that. And then also making sure that you're doing a brief review before you're submitting things into the text field, because it's if there's mistakes or if it's formatted weird, it's not necessarily going to catch those things. So all of the new components and detailed statistical requirements we've noticed often necessitate an earlier start for when you're planning your applications. So now that you have sort of an unlimited amount of space to address design and power, your biostatistician probably needs to be involved earlier in the process to make sure that they're helping you draft that additional section. And then it's also useful for PIs to familiarize themselves with the new clinical trial definition. So as we talked about before, a lot of studies that you would have never have thought had met the definition of a clinical trial now meet that definition. And if your studies fall into that, now that means you have to be aware of that and then also review what those new clinical trial requirements are for an NIH application. So with all that being said, this is a lot of extra work, and so NIH did release a burden statement about the costs associated with the reporting the information appropriately on clinicaltrials.gov. So they have estimated hours for how long this will take. So just note that this is something that can definitely be included in your budget as you're planning your application, because if you are planning on having a clinical trial, you are going to have to register with clinicaltrials.gov, and you may not have thought about the work that could be involved in that. So just keep in mind that this is allowable, and you should incorporate it if you anticipate that that's going to be the case for your study. So with all these updates, the CTSI has been working on a couple of resources to be made available to staff and PIs and faculty across campus. So well, I want to do a brief rundown of what these are and then point you to where you can find these on our website to help you get some more very detailed information on these. So the first thing that we developed was an interactive collection form. And what these are is basically we help you define what type of scenario of human subjects you're planning on studying. Like, is it exempt human subjects? Is it non-exempt? Is it a clinical trial? Is it a delayed onset study? And based on what type of study you have, we have a collection form that walks you through what the new requirements or what the required uploads are for you related to human subjects or clinical trials, so that you're sort of, you can ignore all the components that are not required. So let's say you have a non-exempt human subject study, does not meet the definition of a clinical trial. So our form is basically going to ignore all the clinical trial stuff, so you don't have to worry about trying to fill that in, and just walk you through what's required just for your component. If you do have a clinical trial, you can fill out the clinical trial collection form, and within each requirement, it links off to additional guidance and a template so that you can fill out those components, especially if they're new to you and you need to know, like, what is involved in the study timeline, what does a recruitment and retention plan require, and then to use those guidelines as your template for uploading those documents as well. So these are housed on our website, which is now live, and you can either access it from the CTSI homepage, or we'll link off to it at the end of the presentation here as well. CTSI has also formed some working groups to help coordinate, to help basically identify resources and experts on campus to help provide additional guidance on these application requirements. One of the things we've noticed when, as we've gone through the first round of these changes, is that you do need to engage a lot of experts earlier on in the process. So, contacting Biostat, contacting the IRB Reliance office, people who maybe you could have submitted without their involvement. Now you need to sort of coordinate early to get these documents in the proper form before you can submit. And then we will also be collecting examples. So we're currently looking or soliciting examples of, things like successful protocols, study timelines, other components that are sort of new, so that we can help build up and beef up our library of grant examples, which we have on the CTSI website, so that if you need to know, like, what is a brief study description, like what does a good brief study description look like, that we can start to work on that. So since this is relatively new, these requirements only started as of January 25th of this year. We don't necessarily have any feedback yet from applications that have gone to study section, so it's hard to determine exactly what a good or bad study timeline, component, et cetera, looks like. As we start to get that feedback, we'd love to hear from investigators who might be willing to share some of those components to be made available to others that might be, new or unfamiliar with the process. So here are just some key takeaways to think about as you're working on these new requirements. Just plan early to address these new requirements. Review revisions to the existing components. You may be very familiar with them from having done this for years, but a lot of these have changed ever so slightly, and just to know when to take things out or when other components have been highlighted is really good for moving forward. And then be aware of the relocation of components. So eligibility criteria is no longer in protection of human subjects. It is its own text field instead, and it shouldn't be duplicative, so you have to take it out of one component, put it into its new home. And speaking to that, avoiding potential redundancy. So when you're filling out things like the study description, they're not looking for you to just copy and paste your abstract. You really have to avoid being redundant in all the different components that go into your NIH application. So this has always kind of been true. Like, for instance, when you're filling out, biosketch information, you typically don't copy and paste that straight into your research strategy. You would maybe give a brief overview and then refer people to that if they really needed additional information. So that logic is essentially still the same, but now with so many additional components, you really have to be careful about where you're housing information and making sure that it's in the appropriate place. And referring back to different components within your application. And then think proactively about clinicaltrials.gov registration. So if your study does meet the definition of a clinical trial, you are going to be required to register on clinicaltrials.gov, and a lot of the components that you're submitting in the application phase are specifically for that purpose. And so, for instance, the brief description and the narrative study description are components that are made publicly available on clinicaltrials.gov. So maybe you want to proofread it a little bit more carefully and make sure that the brief study description is written for a lay public. When you're filling out your outcomes, you want to think about it in terms of not outcomes that would necessarily just be nice to collect for an R01, but like what are the outcomes that clinicaltrials.gov registrations is going to require you to to report on. So just think about sort of what the end game is for these clinical trials, because that's sort of the purpose of a lot of these new requirements. And then just start early and be engaged. You know, I think that there's a lot of resources that exist at UCLA that we can leverage to kind of help make these applications a little bit more successful and sort of help ease your burden on not being too overwhelmed with all these new requirements. So the next slide is, and again, we'll post this on the website so you don't have to sit here and try and copy it, but these are a list of mostly NIH links that we found have been really helpful for people. So the NIH SF424 Forms E, so that's the updated guidelines, it lists in detail all the information that I've covered today. So if you're ever not sure of what the new rules are for any of these components, you can always go back to that. The clinicaltrials.gov definitions page provides additional instructions on some of these newer clinical trial components that are good to compare against what's being asked in the 424 link above. If you're not sure your study meets the definition of a clinical trial, the NIH has a really great little questionnaire that sort of interactively walks you through the 4 questions to determine if your study meets that definition. And then there's also separate, but it's called the InfoPath questionnaire, and that helps you determine what type of human subjects protections are needed for your study. So whether it's a clinical trial or not, if you think your study might be exempt from human subjects protection, or you think that maybe you're only using human specimens or data, and so that maybe it doesn't meet the definition of human subjects research, the InfoPath questionnaire will, in a very detailed way, walk you through the different scenarios with mostly yes or no questions and help walk you through to determine what type of scenario your study meets, because that definition will help determine the types of questions that you have to answer in the new NIH application form. And then after all that, if you're really still not sure, NIH case studies, and they're very frequently updating and clarifying these studies, but if you have a study where the participants are physicians and you're not sure if that meets the definition of clinical trial because you're not sure if your modification is an intervention or not, you can look at these studies and really look at the examples they provided, find ones that are similar to the type of study that you're proposing to give you a better idea of how the NIH might classify your study. So with the maybe 15 minutes of time left, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions in the chat function. And I don't know if anybody has, but we did receive some questions that I wanted to go through. So one of the questions we've been getting is people are not sure if their FOA actually allows clinical trials or not. And I wanted to point out that although the studies, or most of these funding opportunities will list within their title whether clinical trials are allowed or not, if they've been updated instead of reissued, sometimes that's not the case. And if that's not the case, there's a new section called Section 2, Award Information, and there's a subsection within that called Clinical Trial ? And so you can scroll down to that section, and it'll basically tell you if they're allowed, required, or optional. So just be on the lookout for that, because the FOAs at this point, I'd say, well, most of them have been reissued. Some of them have just been updated. And so if the title hasn't been reissued with that clarification, there is a new section that you should be able to find that information on. Okay. So another question that we've been getting a lot is when you are filling out the human subjects and clinical trials information form, you have to fill it out for each study record, and people are asking, well, what's a study record? And basically, the NIH defines it as a set of data elements associated with study that involves human subjects. Each proposed protocol must have its own study record, and what that means in terms of you applying for the application, if your study involves human subjects, each proposed study within the application must have its own study record, and essentially you determine the number of study records you need by looking at how many protocols you are planning to have. So if it's really only one protocol, that's probably only one study, meaning only one study record. If your study records would duplicate a lot of the information in those fields, so let's say the interventions and the outcomes, the exclusion criteria is all the same, that's usually an indication that you should have one study record rather than multiple. So when in doubt, NIH really guides you to use fewer rather than more study records, because again, every study record you fill out, you're going to have to fill out all this information individually for that study. However, with that being said, at the moment, NIH has really said that you know, if you do too many study records, they're not going to kick back your application because of that. They might just ask you for clarification during just-in-time, because that information can kind of be adjusted later. So just think about your study, how many protocols, how many distinct protocols you think you might need, and then if you can not duplicate as much information as possible, so go with less rather than fewer. So going back to the text field rules, a lot of our investigators have expressed some kind of frustrations with the limitations on the text fields, and so there's questions on how to address those text boxes with really large character limits. So the narrative study description, for instance, has 32,000 characters as your limit, and that's a couple pages of text that you have to insert into a pretty tiny text box. So just a reminder, so a couple of the things that the NIH recommends is that the characters should be in plain text. You should not be incorporating any like smart or curly quotes, long dashes, proprietary fonts, special characters. Those all get lost, including any formatting. So if you're bolding, using bullet points, subscripts, superscripts, that is not going to transfer over. And then also, you cannot include tables, graphics, or figures, because again, it's just a text field, so that information is not going to carry over. So if you really need to format paragraph spaces, for instance, so, you know, 32,000 characters, that's a couple pages. You probably have a couple paragraphs within each page. So if you need to format that, basically insert a blank line between the paragraphs. If you're formatting bullet lists, like I mentioned earlier, use list items such as hyphens or asterisks, followed by space, and then the text for that list item. And then on the CTSI website, which I've listed on the screen here, this is where all of our resources are for all of these new guidelines, and we've also linked off to some of the NIH websites that are really useful, one of which is a website just on their text field limitations. So if you are struggling with that or are not sure how to deal with it, you can review that page for the specific limitations that are within that. In the requirement for listing the conditions or focus of the study, we've gotten a couple of people who are unfamiliar with the requirement for using a mesh heading. So just a really brief overview for those who are not familiar. Mesh headings stands for medical subject headings, and they are the National Laboratory of Medicine's curated medical vocabulary for keywords for which studies and publications are organized. So if you're used to looking up articles on PubMed using keywords. It's kind of like that. So it's this basically hierarchically organized terminology that helps you index or catalog biomedical information. So if you're unsure what the MESH term or heading is for your particular condition or study, there's a link on the MESH website where it's basically a search function. So you can type in your particular, say it's like a particular disease you're working on or particular demographic you're looking at. You can type that in and it'll show you if there's a MESH heading that's associated with it. For the most part, they're self-explanatory, but the MESH heading search function can be hard to find. So again, we've listed it on our website to make it a little bit easier for you to track that down if that's something that you're unfamiliar with. If you are studying, if it's a condition or focus of the study that doesn't have a MESH term, you are not required to use it, but we recommend just checking the link just to make sure that there's nothing that might exist that fits already. So another question that we've gotten is about the retention component of the recruitment and retention plan. So I think a lot of people are familiar with recruitment and informed consent, but less so with the retention plan. Like, what is that? What does that mean? So if your study, whether it's a clinical trial or not, involves more than one interaction point for participants, meaning they have to come for multiple visits, maybe there's like longitudinal follow-up, the NIH requires that you provide a retention plan to help mitigate potential loss or dropout rates, which would, in turn, decrease the power for your statistical analysis. And they also highlight that this is particularly important if you anticipate that your retention will be difficult. So if you're only seeing, the human subject participants at one point and then there's no follow-up after that, you can just state that in your retention plan. You don't have to get into detail about it if it doesn't apply to your study. Another question we have is, okay, what's the difference between a brief summary and a narrative study description? So again, both of these are requirements that come from clinicaltrials.gov registrations, and as you'll notice from the slides we showed earlier, the brief summary is really brief. I mean, it's 5,000 characters, and I think the key takeaway is that it is for the lay public, so it really has to be summarized for a non-scientific audience. The narrative study description is also a brief description of the protocol, but because the limitation is 32,000 characters, you can include more of that technical information, and it does not have to be summarized for the lay public, so it can be, as technical as it needs to be to get the point across. However, just to caveat again, this does not mean that you include your entire study protocol. They are not requiring that at the NIH application phase. It should really just be a summary of the what your protocol plan is going to be. Oh, another question we have is about the study phase. So in section 4 of the new form, if you have a clinical trial, you're required to use this little drop-down option to select what study phase your study is under, and I think we're familiar with, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but if you have a behavioral outcome study, a lot of times if you look at the study phase definitions, none of them address behavioral outcomes. So within the form, there's an option called Other. So in the drop-down, if you have a behavioral outcome study, we recommend that you select the Other for basically any trials that don't have phases. So this includes behavioral interventional studies and device studies that don't have multiple phases. So this is if you do select Other, though, you will be required to include a brief sentence explaining why you're selecting Other. So you would say something simple, just it's a behavioral outcome study, doesn't have a phase, etc. And then another question is about the difference between the dissemination plan versus the dissemination component of the resource sharing plan. And so we went over that a little bit, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. So If you have a clinical trial, you are required to submit a dissemination plan, which is a separate document that gets uploaded into the new information form. And you basically have to address three criteria. And they essentially just want to make sure that you are going to stay compliant with the clinicaltrials.gov registrations policy that is required for all clinical trials. And this includes things like making sure that you submit the information in a timely manner, make sure that your institution has a policy in place to ensure compliance. And so it's not asking you about things like how are you going to disseminate this to the public. You know, they're not looking for that you're meeting with community groups or that you're going to be presenting at conferences. It's not that at all. So that stuff, if it applies to your study, will still stay in the resource sharing plan or in the research strategy, depending on the particular funding opportunity announcement that you're applying to. But the dissemination plan itself is specifically related to the clinical trials aspect and the requirements for for registering there. So again, with all that said, please visit our website because we do have individual guidance on each of these components where we break down in explicit detail what the individual requirements guidelines are from the NIH. If you're unfamiliar with any of these components or just need a refresher or need to see what's been changed about existing pieces, within those you can also access the collection form, which you and your fund manager can use to kind of pass off back and forth for filling out the information to submit to NIH, and then all of the resources that we're collecting and building will also be housed here as well. So if after that you have any other questions or you'd like to follow up with us after the event, our telephone number and email address is listed here. So we're gsu@mednet.ucla.edu, and we're happy to help answer any questions. You know, again, these are really new requirements. You know, that we're only in, you know, less than 2 months out from when these changes have taken place. So I think everybody's still kind of learning together, and we're happy to help walk you through any questions or issues that you might have. So thank you everybody for participating today, and please reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Thank you.